The first sound I heard when I climbed out of the shaft was nothing, not quiet, not peaceful, nothing, no wind moving through leaves, no distant traffic, no aircraft cutting across the sky, no birds. The world above me was so completely still that the sound of my own boots on the gravel felt like a crime. I stood at the mouth of the survey shaft, 2 km below the surface of what used to be northern Scotland, and I looked at a sky that had no clouds, no contrails, no satellites blinking in the pale morning light, just blue, empty. Blue, like the world had been swept clean. While I was underground, my name is Cale Marrow. I was 34 years old, an orbital engineer contracted by the European Geological Survey. I had been underground for 11 days running deep core mineral mapping on a project that was already 2 weeks behind schedule. I had no idea that while I was down there measuring rock and arguing with my equipment, everything above me had ended. I stood at the surface for a long time before I moved. The road that led from the survey site to the nearest village was empty. Not empty the way roads are empty at 5:00 in the morning. Empty the way roads are empty in photographs of places that no longer exist. There were cars on it stopped in the middle of lanes, some with doors open. There were bags on the ground. Beside them, personal things, a coat, a child's shoe, a phone face down in a puddle, its screen still faintly lit. I did not touch any of it. I walked 2 miles to the village of Kinloch and found it the same way, shops open, lights on inside, no one at the counters, a restaurant with food still on the tables, half-eaten, steam long gone from the plates, a post office with the front door wide open and letters scattered across the floor like they had spilled from someone's arms. Mid-step, there were no bodies. That detail did not comfort me the way you might expect. The absence of bodies was somehow worse. It meant that whatever had happened had not happened fast. It had given people enough time to stop what they were doing, to reach for each other, to try to get somewhere, and then it had taken them anyway. I found a working radio in the back of a hardware shop, military-grade shortwave, battery-powered. I turned it on and spent 3 hours moving through every frequency I knew. What I found was mostly silence. Some frequencies had automated signals still cycling, digital pings bouncing off dead satellites out of habit, equipment doing its job with no one left to read the output. On one frequency, barely audible under layers of interference, I caught something that was not automated, a voice, low, careful, speaking in English with a slight accent I eventually placed as Norwegian. Her name was Nell Akaffer. She was a glaciologist stationed at a remote ice monitoring post in Svalbard, 800 km above the Arctic Circle. She had been outside in a polar survey suit when it happened and had seen the effect pass through the air like a wave. She described it as a shimmer, a horizontal ripple moving across the landscape, visible the way heat distortion is visible above summer roads, therefore just a moment and then gone. Her 2 colleagues who had been inside the station without suits on were gone. Within hours, Nell had the presence of mind to seal the station and stay in her suit until she was certain the air was safe again. By the time she risked removing the helmet, she was alone in one of the most remote places on the planet. We talked for 4 hours that first night. She was calm in a way that frightened me more than panic would have. Nell had a scientist's way of describing things precise and careful. But underneath the precision was a person holding herself very still, because she knew that if she stopped holding still, something in her would come apart. She told me what she had been able to piece together from the satellite data feeds before they went dark. Whatever had spread across the Earth had moved in a pattern consistent with atmospheric deployment. It had begun over 6 separate points simultaneously at high altitude and had dispersed across the planet over approximately 18 hours. It was not a natural event. The geometry of it was too deliberate, the timing too precise. I asked her if she thought it was a weapon. She was quiet for a moment, then she said that the word weapon implied someone was angry. Whatever this was, she did not think anger had anything to do with it. That sentence stayed with me. I kept turning it over in my mind while I searched the village for supplies, while I slept in the back of an empty hotel with the windows locked, while I drove a borrowed car south along roads that grew no less empty, no matter how far I went. Whatever this was, anger had nothing to do with it. Over the following week, I established contact with 9 more survivors, a retired civil engineer named Owen Bassett, who had been deep inside a Welsh slate mine, inspecting old tunnels, a teenager named Cora Tillies, who had been trapped flood-up lid basement during a flash flood and had survived inside an air pocket, terrified and shivering, not knowing that the air above her was what she was being protected from, a marine biologist named Hadley Voss, who had been on a pressurized deep-sea research platform off the Azores, a pair of cave climbers, brothers named Leon and Dale Marsh, who had been 300 m underground in southern France when the shimmer passed through the world above them. We were not survivors in any heroic sense. We were people who had happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, underground or isolated or submerged, when whatever had moved through the air decided not to wait for us. We were accidents of circumstance, nothing more. 11 days after I emerged from the shaft, I was sitting in the ruins of a university computer lab in Edinburgh, running the last working terminal in the building, trying to access any network that still had active nodes. The power grid was still functioning in some areas, running on automated systems that had no way of knowing their operators were gone. I was using that borrowed time to dig through whatever data remained accessible. I found the signal. By accident, I was not looking for it. I was to reach a weather satellite feed and routed through a frequency I did not recognize. What came back was not weather data. It was a file, a transmission log, compressed, partially encrypted, but not well encrypted, not the way military communications are encrypted, more the way administrative files are encrypted, office documents, records. I spent 2 hours breaking the encryption with tools I had downloaded from a university cybersecurity archive. When the file opened, it was not in any language I recognized visually, but attached to it was an auto-translation module, and I realized, sitting alone, that dark lab with the emergency lights casting everything in pale yellow, that I was looking at a translation tool designed to make communications readable to any species that might intercept them. Any species. I ran the translation. The document was a filing record, a formal administrative log. The header, once translated, read something close to Dominion Assessment Division, Class 0, Biological Threat Resolution, Case reference 7741H, Planet 3 orbital. Star system G-type yellow, sector 14. I read it 3 times. The language was dry and precise in the way that legal documents are dry and precise. It described a review process, a committee, 7-member civilizations of something called the Verath Dominion had convened to assess a newly discovered species in a previously unmonitored system. The species demonstrated advanced tool use, territorial conflict, rapid adaptive behavior, and high reproductive resilience. The committee had classified the species as a Class 0 contaminant, defined in the document as a biological entity whose unchecked expansion posed a statistically significant threat to established galactic ecosystems and social orders. The resolution protocol had been approved unanimously. The nanophase deployment had been authorized, executed, and confirmed. At the bottom of the document, in the equivalent of a digital signature field, was a single notation. It translated as best as I could render it to something like file closed, case complete, no further monitoring required. I sat in that yellow light for a very long time. I had expected somewhere in the back of my mind that if something like this had been done to us, it would have been done out of fear or hatred or competition. I had expected rage on their end, or desperation, or some kind of terrible urgency that would at least make the loss feel significant to them. Instead, I was reading an office document, a completed form, a checkbox that had been ticked. We were not a species that had been hated or feared or even really considered. We were a problem that had been identified, evaluated, and resolved. We were a file that had been closed. I called Nell on the radio that night. I did not tell her everything I had read. I told her I had found something important and that she needed to know we were not alone in the universe, and that the thing responsible for what had happened to our world had done it with the same emotion with which a person deletes an old email they no longer need. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she said, "Cale, are you angry?" I thought about it. I looked out through the cracked window of the lab at a city full of stopped cars and open doors and the personal belongings of 8 billion people lying exactly where they had been left. "No," I said, "that was a lie," but it was the kind of lie you tell yourself when you need to keep thinking clearly, when you know that what you feel is too large to look at directly and also do anything useful at the same time. I closed the translation file. I saved a copy to every storage device I had. I opened a new document on the terminal and began writing down everything I knew, everything I had found, and everything I intended to do about it. The file was not closed. I was going to make sure of that. The second week after the world went quiet, I stopped sleeping through the night. It was not grief that kept me awake, though grief was certainly there, a weight behind everything I did, pressing down on the back of every thought. It was the calculations. Numbers kept assembling themselves in my head the moment I closed my eyes. Population estimates, resource timelines, signal ranges, the rough arithmetic of survival when survival is being attempted by a group small enough to fit in a single large room. By the time 3 weeks had passed, we had made contact with 41 survivors across 11 countries. Nell managed the communications network from Svalbard, organizing the signal schedules with the same systematic precision she had applied to glacial data. Owen Bassett, who turned out to have an engineering background broad enough to cover everything from structural load calculations to basic electrical repair, had gotten 3 separate radio relay stations running across Britain using salvaged parts and a lot of patience. Leon and Dale Marsh were moving through southern Europe in a vehicle they had, loaded with tools and medical supplies, making contact with survivors in person, where possible, and bringing them into a loose network of safe locations. Safe. That word already felt dishonest. Truth was that nowhere was safe in the sense we used to mean. The nanophage had dispersed and become inert. Nell had confirmed this through careful atmospheric sampling over a period of 10 days, comparing the results against the biological parameters she had reverse engineered from the Veridian document I had shared with the group. The air was clean, the water was clean, the danger was gone in that sense, but safe from. What came next was a different question entirely. Owen was the one who raised it, first in his broad northern English way. During one of our evening radio sessions, he said, "We've established that the air isn't going to finish us. Good, now what finishes us is the cold, the dark, and the fact that there are 41 of us on a planet built for 8 billion. We need to be honest about that." No one argued with him. The infrastructure of the world was running on borrowed time. Power grids operated on automated systems, but those systems required maintenance and fuel, and without human intervention they would begin failing. Within months, food supplies were abundant in the short term. Every warehouse and store and cold facility packed with goods that had no one to consume them, but cold facilities needed power, and preserved goods had expiration dates, and none of it was being replenished. The medical picture was manageable for now, but frightening in the longer term. We were caretakers of a civilization's corpse, and the corpse was going to start decaying whether we wanted it to or not. But before any of that, before we could even begin to think practically about long-term survival, we had to address the problem that had no comfortable name. I called it the monitoring problem. The Verith filing document had included a reference to what it called M protocols, a standard procedure following the deployment of a Class 0 resolution. In plain terms, it meant that the Dominion would periodically check that the resolution had been effective. They had left automated sensors in orbit. I suspected equipment designed to confirm the absence of the species in question, and to alert the Dominion if any biological signatures consistent with the target were detected. We were being watched by a machine that had been told to look for us. I shared this with the group on a night when we had managed to get 17 of our 41 connected simultaneously, which was a record for our network at that point. The reaction was mixed. Hadley Voss, who had the most scientific background among us outside of Nell, immediately began asking questions about sensor range and detection thresholds. Cora, who was 16 and had already proven herself to be faster and more laterally minded than most of the adults in our group, asked whether we could feed the sensors false information. That question stopped the conversation. I had been thinking the same thing for days, but had not said it out loud, because saying it out loud meant committing to a direction, and I was not certain the group would choose the direction I was leaning toward. Cora did not have that hesitation. She was 16 and had watched the world end, and she had already moved past the stage of being careful about what she said. If they're looking for heat signatures and biological markers, she said, and we can find out exactly what they're looking for, we can make sure they don't see it. We go dark, we move like we don't exist. And we use the time that buys us, use it. For what? One of the others asked. No one answered that immediately, but I think most of us already knew. Finding the drone took 11 days. Owen and I worked together on it using the signal analysis tools I had pulled from the university lab and a tracking method Owen had devised based on the drone's intermittent data pulses. It was sitting in a field outside of Bristol, partially buried, designed to look like debris from a satellite re-entry. Up close, it was clearly not terrestrial. The materials were wrong. The geometry was slightly off in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Like looking at something that had been assembled by someone who understood the concept of a rock but had never actually held one. It was transmitting on a narrow band frequency at irregular intervals, automated, patient, just doing its job. Owen wanted to take it apart immediately. I convinced him to wait. We spent 2 weeks studying the drone before we touched it. Nell analyzed the transmission patterns. Cora, who had a gift for electronic systems that she herself seemed surprised by, mapped the internal logic of the device from the outside by measuring its response variations to different stimuli. What we learned was that the drone was not sophisticated in the ways we had feared. It was sophisticated in range and sensitivity. Yes, but its internal decision-making was simple. It was looking for specific signatures. If those signatures were absent, it reported absence. It had no capacity to be suspicious. It had no ability to consider whether absence might be manufactured. It was, in a word, bureaucratic. It did the job it was assigned and nothing more. Cora called it a very expensive filing cabinet. We fed it false data on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, 3 months after the world went quiet. We did not destroy it. We did not move it. We carefully, methodically rewrote the information it was sending to tell whoever was listening that the planet below was exactly what they expected. Empty, still, clean, and done. Humanity went officially extinct on a Tuesday. We celebrated with tinned fruit and a bottle of wine from Owen's personal stash that he had been saving for what he called moment. It was not a happy celebration exactly. It was the kind of quiet acknowledgement that something important had happened, that a door had been closed, that we had closed ourselves, that we had chosen to be invisible, and in doing so had bought ourselves something. Time. The question of what to do with the time split the group in ways I had been expecting but had hoped might not materialize so quickly. There were people in our network who wanted to rebuild quietly, to find a valley or an island, to pool resources, to have children and grow food and wait for several generations to pass before worrying about anything beyond basic survival. It was not a cowardly position. It was a human position, the oldest and most fundamental human position, which is to protect what remains and keep it safe. I understood it completely. I disagreed with it completely. I laid out my argument one evening when we had our largest connection yet, 23 people on the network at once. I did not make it an emotional argument. I had learned by Then that emotional arguments, however, justified lose people, I made it a mathematical one, 2,000 people scattered, and without infrastructure attempting generational rebuilding on a planet with failing power systems and no supply chains had a survival probability that I estimated conservatively at somewhere between 12 and 20% over the next century. The variables were too hostile: disease, accident, infertility, rates in a population that's small, the psychological weight of isolation, the eventual failure of every piece of technology they depended on without the industrial base to replace it. 2,000 people with access to the entire technological legacy of a civilization of 8 billion with a unified purpose and the advantage of invisibility had a survival probability I could not calculate with a ceiling. We are not survivors, I said. We are the only people left who know what happened to us and why, and we are the only people who can do anything about it. Someone asked what I thought we could do. The Varith Dominion was a coalition of 7 civilizations with technology centuries beyond our own, spread across a galaxy we had never navigated, who currently believed we were gone. They believe we are gone, I said. That is the only advantage we will ever have, and it expires the moment we stop using it. Right now to them, we are a closed case. An old file. I paused, then I said something that I had been thinking about since the night I read that document in the university lab. The only thing more dangerous than an enemy who is preparing for you is an enemy who has stopped preparing for you entirely. They are not afraid of us. They are not watching for us. They have filed us and moved on, and that means we can move without anyone looking. The vote that night was not unanimous. 153 of our network's 212 confirmed members chose not to participate in what I was proposing. They were free to make that choice, and I respected it genuinely. Some of them later changed their minds. Some of them did not. The rest of us began the second phase of our existence that night. We did not call ourselves an army. We did not call ourselves a resistance. Cora suggested the name that stuck, offered it almost offhandedly in the middle of a practical discussion about power grid maintenance, and it stayed because it was exactly right. She said, we're the invoice, aren't we? Everything they owe. Written down and waiting, the invoice. That was what we became. In the months that followed, we worked in the strain double life of ghosts who were also engineers. On the surface, visible to whatever sensors remained in orbit, the Earth was dead. No heat signatures beyond background levels, no electromagnetic transmissions, no movement patterns consistent with intelligent life below that surface, invisible in the ways that mattered. We were anything but quiet. Hadley Voss turned out to have a background in biochemistry that went well beyond marine biology. She had spent 3 years in pharmaceutical research before switching to ocean studies, and she had never entirely let go of that first discipline. Working with Nell and a materials scientist named Graham Osai, who had been found in a deep tunnel facility in Ghana, she began the work of fully understanding the nanophage at a molecular level, not just its weaknesses, of which the cold temperature sensitivity was only the most obvious, its architecture, its logic, the biological grammar it used to identify and affect its target. It took 4 months of work that I cannot fully describe because most of it happened in a language of science I only partially speak. What I can say is that by the end of those 4 months, Hadley had something in a sealed container that the Verith Dominion would not have recognized as derived from their own technology. She had taken their instrument and rewritten the sheet music. Owen, meanwhile, was solving the larger infrastructure problem with a thoroughness that impressed even the people who had doubted him at the start. He had organized 30 of our most technically capable members into maintenance teams, each responsible for a specific grid region, working out of centralized bases that were invisible from above. He kept the power running in our key locations. He kept the water treatment systems functional. He kept the automated factories online, not producing anything yet, just idling, maintained and ready. And I was working on the orbital systems. This was the part of the plan that I had kept mostly to myself until I was certain it was viable, because it was the part that, if I described it prematurely, would have sounded insane. I was an orbital engineer for 12 years before the survey job. I had worked on launch systems, satellite deployment, and low orbit infrastructure. I knew those systems the way Owen knew power grids. I knew which ones were still functioning. I knew which ones were autonomous enough to be operated remotely with the right access codes. And I had spent 11 days underground before any of this happened, with nothing to do but memorize access protocols. There was a satellite-based kinetic intercept system in polar orbit. It had been designed as an emergency debris clearing platform for near-Earth orbital lanes, able to redirect small projectiles using targeted electromagnetic pulses. It had never been used for anything other than routine debris management. No one had ever needed to use it for anything else. By the 14th month after the world went quiet, I had full operational control of it. By that point, we had also made contact with, by our best estimate, just over 2,000 confirmed survivors globally. The number had grown steadily as our network expanded, and as people who had been hiding alone or in very small groups found our signals. 2,000 people on a planet of empty cities, operating invisibly, sitting on the greatest concentration of abandoned technology in the known history of the galaxy. The Verith Dominion had filed the case and closed it and moved on. We had been busy with the file. The Verith freighter showed up on my tracking display on a morning in early spring, 14 months after the world went quiet, and I had approximately 4 minutes to make a decision. It was not the first that had passed through the solar system since the erasure. In the months prior, I had logged 3 separate transit signals, all of them moving quickly through the outer system without slowing, following trajectories consistent with ships that had a destination elsewhere and were simply passing through. Each time I had held my breath and waited, and they had moved on without showing any interest in the third planet. This one was different. This one was slowing. It had entered the system from the direction of Jupiter and was adjusting its trajectory in a way that was very clearly oriented toward Earth. The adjustments were small, incremental, the kind of course corrections a vessel makes when it is targeting a specific point rather than passing through a general region. It was not moving fast, it was moving carefully. I got Owen on the radio first, because Owen was always the person I wanted to have a clear head nearby when Mine started moving too quickly. I told him what I was seeing. He asked 3 questions in sequence. How large is the vessel? How many crew does the configuration suggest? Is it armed? Large enough to matter? 3 to 5 crew based on the profile? Possibly. Armed but not in a way that suggested an assault vessel, logistic ship. Owen said survey or transport. I had reached the same conclusion. The Dominion's filing document had included a reference to what's it called, secondary resource assessment, which I had understood as the possibility that once a Class 0 resolution was complete, the cleared system might be evaluated for resource extraction by other Dominion members. This was almost certainly that assessment beginning. They were coming to see what we had left behind. I had 4 minutes to decide whether to let them pass, go darken, maintain our invisibility, or to use what I had built. I want to be honest about what that moment was like. It was not a moment of cold strategic calculation, though I tried to make it that. It was not clean or certain. I was sitting in a concrete relay station in northern England with a mug of cold tea beside me and a tracking display showing a vessel that represented the civilization that had decided we were not worth keeping, and I felt something that I will simply describe as a clarity of purpose so complete that it made my hands very steady. I keyed the orbital intercept system. The electromagnetic pulse that hit the freighter was not designed to destroy it. I had been very careful about that. I needed the vessel intact. I needed the people on it alive and capable of communication. A dead ship tells you nothing and gives you nothing to work with. What I needed was a stopped ship with a confused crew who had absolutely no framework for understanding what had just happened to them, because as far as the Verith Dominion was concerned, there was no one in this system capable of doing it. The freighter lost propulsion and went into a slow drift within minutes of the pulse. I tracked it for 2 hours, confirming that it had power and life support and no apparent distress beacon, which meant either they had not wished to activate one or they had decided for reasons of their own not to. I sent 3 of our fastest people to intercept the ship in a vessel. We had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of encounter, a repurposed cargo shuttle that we had rebuilt over 4 months in an underground facility in the Scottish Highlands. Its exterior had been modified to look as close to derelict as possible while remaining fully functional. From a distance it's like space debris. Up close it was a very well-maintained spacecraft operated by people with a very specific purpose. Nell led the boarding team. I had wanted it to be me, and Nell had talked me out of it with a single sentence. She had said, "You're the only person in our network who fully understands the orbital systems and the interceptor controls. You cannot be the person we lose." She was right, and I disliked that she was right, so I stayed at the tracking station and monitored the operation through the communication link they carried with them. The boarding took 40 minutes. The freighter's crew did not offer resistance, which surprised me until Nell explained why. There were 3 of them. They were not military, they were assessment personnel, which in the Dominion structure apparently meant something close to what we would call civil servants, surveyors, record keepers, people who went to places after the difficult work was done and counted what was there. They had, in the most practical sense, no preparation for anyone boarding their ship there. Security systems were designed against equipment failures and space hazards, not against a species that was supposed to be gone. One of them, when Nell's team entered the main cabin, initially thought they were some kind of automated maintenance system that had come from the vessel they had arrived in. It apparently took several seconds for the crew to process that the figures in front of them were biological, and several more seconds after that to process what species they were looking at. Nell told me later that the reaction was not fear, it was something that in human terms she could only describe as a profound administrative confusion, like watching some discover that a report they had already filed and archived had somehow walked into their office and sat down. We brought them to a secure location on the surface. We treated them well. This was not generosity, it was policy. Whatever happened next would depend in part on the information these three individuals carried with them. And people who are treated badly do not give you accurate information willingly. People who are confused and physically comfortable and not threatened often talk at length because the silence feels more frightening to them than the conversation. I conducted the first interview through a translation system that Graham had built using the AUT translation module from the Dominion filing document as its base, supplemented by 4 months of language analysis work that Cora had led within obsessive thoroughness that I found both admirable and slightly worrying in a teenager. The senior member of the freighter crew was called something that translated imperfectly to a name, something like Assessor 12 of the Surveyor Division. I called him 12, which he did not seem to object to, possibly because he was still in a state of profound confusion that made small details difficult to process. He was physically unlike anything I had seen, though I will not spend too much time on description because I have found that description of the unfamiliar takes up space that could be used for more important things. He was functional, clearly intelligent, clearly trained, administrative thinking, and clearly operating at the outer edge of his coping capacity. I sat across from him in a room that we had set up as neutrally as possible, with a table between us and no weapons visible, and I told him through the translation system that I wanted to have a conversation. He looked at me for a long time, then through the translator he said something that came out as, "Your designation is Class 0. Your case is marked complete. You are not supposed to be here." "I know," I said. "That is what I want to talk to you about." What followed was 4 hours of conversation that I would describe, for all its strangeness and difficulty, as one of the most clarifying experiences of my life. 12 was not cruel. He was not villainous in any personal sense. He was a functionary of an enormous system who had never had any reason to question whether the system's classifications were correct, because the system's classifications had always been applied to species that were not able to sit across a table from him and explain how it felt. He had voted for nothing. He had decided nothing. He was not among the 7 civilizations that had made the original ruling. He was simply someone who came afterward to count what was left, but he knew the system. He knew its structure, and when I began asking him specific questions about how the Dominion operated, about its member species and their home systems and its decision-making processes and its communication infrastructure, I discovered something that I had hoped was true but had not been certain of. 12 had very good administrative memory. The session produced more data than we had collected in 14 months of working. From the original filing document alone, home system coordinates for all 7, member civilizations, communication, frequency ranges, the structure of the Dominion Council, the location of its primary deliberation station, security, protocols for Dominion vessels, the schedule of planned assessment missions, to our system, of which this freighter's visit had apparently been the first. I thanked 12 at the end of the session. I meant it. We spent the next 3 days going through the data core of the freighter itself, which Cora approached with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and which yielded, in addition to navigational and technical data, something I had not expected: a full archive of Dominion species profiles, not just clinical assessments, like the filing document that had told us what they thought of us, cultural records, historical summaries, information about how each of the 7 civilizations thought, what they valued, what they feared, how they made decisions. Understanding someone is not the same as forgiving them, but it is the beginning of knowing what to do about them. We kept the freighter crew comfortable and secure while we worked. We gave them food and a space to rest, and we answered the questions they asked us honestly, which seemed to unsettle them in ways that deception would not have. They had frameworks for hostility. They did not have frameworks for a supposedly eradicated species calmly explaining its situation over meals. On the 4th day, I composed a transmission. It was a single message broadcast on the main Dominion communication frequency that 12 had eventually and somewhat reluctantly confirmed for us. The message contained no words, no demands, no threats, no explanation. It contained 2 things: Earth's coordinates labeled as a point of origin, and a signature, plain translated text that read, "Still here." I sent it on a clear channel at maximum power from 3 separate relay points to ensure it could not be missed, could not be attributed to equipment malfunction, and could not be ignored. Then I sat down the transmitter, walked outside the relay station, and looked up at a sky that was still empty of everything it used to hold. Somewhere out there in a system we now had the coordinates for, someone was going to receive that message and read it. Someone in an administrative office, or a council chamber, or a vessel crossing a part of the galaxy we had never been able to see, was going to look at those coordinates and that signature and feel something. I did not know exactly what they would feel, but I knew it would not be nothing, and I knew that it would not be the comfortable, bureaucratic certainty of a case that had been filed and closed and forgotten. That was the first thing I had to give them. It would not be the last. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes just before something large and irreversible happens. I have felt it a few times in my life: the seconds before a structural collapse, the moment before a launch sequence completes, a stillness that has weight to it that you can feel pressing against the inside of your chest. I felt it when the Verith fleet appeared on our long-range tracking systems 19 days after I sent the transmission. 312 vessels, that was the number Owen reported to me, his voice completely flat, and even the way Owen's voice got when he had processed something that was too large for normal emotional expression and had set the emotional part aside to deal with the practical part first. 312 vessels approaching from the direction of the outer system, decelerating in a configuration consistent with orbital insertion rather than a passing trajectory. They were not passing through, they were coming to Earth. I spent the first hour after receiving Owen's report doing exactly nothing which was deliberate. I had a plan. We had been building the plan for 14 months. I knew the plan was sound. But there is a difference between knowing something in theory and standing at the edge of it when the moment arrives, and I needed that hour to make sure that what I was feeling and what I was thinking were in alignment before I started making decisions. What I was feeling was something I do not have a precise word for. It was not quite fear, and it was not quite excitement, and it was not quite the grief rage that had been sitting behind everything I did since the day I climbed out of the survey shaft and found the world gone. It was all of those things arranged into something else, something that felt more than anything like seriousness. This was serious. This required all of me. After the hour, I called the full network, every person we had, 2,047 individuals connected through the relay system Owen had spent over a year building, listening on every available device. I told them what was coming. I told them what we were going to do. I asked them to do their parts. Then I went to work. The key to the entire plan was the reprogrammed nanophage. Hadley and Nell and Graham had spent months perfecting it. What they had created was not a copy of the original weapon. It was a derivative, engineered from the same base architecture but with fundamentally different targeting parameters. The original had been calibrated to affect human neural tissue. The derivative was calibrated to affect Verith biochemistry, specifically drawn from the biological data and the species profiles we had pulled from the freighter's data core, but it did not do what the original had done. This was a choice we had made deliberately in a long discussion that had taken 3 separate sessions and involved nearly every senior member of our network. Hadley had been clear that she could engineer something lethal if that was what we wanted. She could make a nanophage that would do to the Verith fleet what the Dominion's weapon had done to our world. The capability was there. We decided not to, not because of moral scruple alone, though the moral dimension was real, and we discussed it seriously. We decided not to because of practicality. A dead fleet tells the Dominion we are dangerous, but does not tell them we are worth negotiating with. A paralyzed fleet, a fleet that has been stopped and held and rendered helpless by a species they believed they had eradicated, tells them something far more important. It tells them they made a mistake in their assessment. The derivative nanophage targeted the Verith nervous system, signal processing layer, a biological structure analogous to what in humans we would call the sensory integration pathway. Exposure to it caused temporary but complete disruption of sensory input. No vision, no hearing, no spatial orientation, no ability to interpret environmental information of any kind. Fully reversible, no lasting effect but for the duration, complete and total helplessness. We called it the blindfold. The deploying it required getting it into the orbital approach corridor before the fleet arrived. We had 21 hours from the moment they appeared on our tracking systems to the moment their leading vessels would begin orbital insertion. I needed to get the blindfold into the upper atmosphere at High altitude at multiple points along the approach path insufficient. Concentration to affect every vessel. The fleet, this was the part that required the orbital systems I had been preparing for 14 months. I will not walk through the technical details because they are long and I want to focus on what mattered. What mattered was that over the following 18 hours, working from the relay station in Scotland with Owen's team providing ground support and Cora managing the targeting calculations from her station. Southern France, we used a combination of repurposed atmospheric deployment satellites and 3 modified high-altitude sounding rockets to distribute the blindfold across a 300 km orbital corridor directly above the equatorial approach path. The deployment was invisible from above. Concentrations were well below the threshold of anything a Verith sensor would flag as a biological agent because we had set the dispersal density precisely to that edge after weeks of calculation based on the biological sensitivity data from the freighters. Medical systems, they would not know it was there until it was already working. The leading edge of the Verith fleet began orbital insertion at 14 minutes past midday on a Thursday. I was watching from the tracking station. Owen was beside me. Nell was on communication from Svalbard. Hadley was monitoring the blindfold's atmospheric performance indicators. Cora was running the kinetic interceptor system from France because by this point she was better at it than I was, and we both knew it. The fleet moved through the corridor in formation. Precise, orderly, a coalition of 7 civilizations with centuries of space travel experience executing a straightforward orbital approach to a planet they believed to be empty on a mission that was, from their perspective, essentially administrative. They were coming to confirm that the case was still closed. The blindfold took effect across the entire leading formation within 40 seconds of their entry into the corridor. The vessels did not explode, they did not crash, they drifted. Their formation lost its shape as the coordination between ships that depended on crew-operated communication systems simply stopped happening. 312 vessels spread across a corridor that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, reduced to the collective equivalent of people standing in a dark room with no sense of direction. They were not hurt. They were stopped. I gave it 20 minutes. Then I keyed the communication system on the flagship frequency, which 12 had provided us and which we had confirmed against the freighter's own communication logs. In translated Verith, the message was simple. This is Earth. We have stopped your fleet. Your crews are unharmed and will remain so. We are coming aboard. Then I looked at Owen. He said, your turn. The ESV remainder had been named by a group vote, and the name had won because it meant 2 things. We were the remainder of a species. We were also what was left over after a calculation had been completed, the number that did not divide evenly, the quantity that was supposed to be 0 but had come out as something else. We had 17 people on board for the flagship boarding, 17 people to walk through a 300-ship fleet and reach the command vessel of the largest military force humanity had ever faced. We did it in 4 hours. The flagship was large in a way that was difficult to process, designed for a civilization that operated at a different scale than we did. The corridors were wide, the ceilings were high, the lighting was calibrated for visual systems that processed the spectrum differently than ours, but the crew was helpless, and helpless means navigable regardless of scale. The high assessor of the Verith Dominion was in the command chamber. I had read about this position in the profile data from the freighters. The high assessor was not a military rank. It was the senior administrative authority of the Dominion Council, the individual responsible for ratifying major resolutions, the individual whose designation appeared at the bottom of the most important filings, including ours. He was already trying to recover his sensory function when we reached him. The blindfold was beginning to wear off for the earliest exposed crew members, and he was visibly working through the disorientation of returning perception. He heard us before he could see us, and he turned toward the sound, and then his vision cleared enough to focus. I have no way of knowing with certainty what his emotional state was in that moment, but I have thought about what I would feel in his position, recovering from sensory disruption, to find that the species whose case I had signed off on was standing in my command chamber. I imagine it was something that had no easy name. I sat down across from him. Without asking permission, I put the translation device on the table between us, and then I did what I had decided to do months earlier when we were planning this phase, and the question of what to do with the leadership of the fleet had come up in discussion. I did not threaten him. I did not make demands, not yet. I opened a display screen and I pressed play. What followed was 6 hours. I had compiled it myself over many weeks, pulling from every archive and database and hard drive that our network had access across the planet. Every museum collection that had been digitized, every library archive, every film, every piece of recorded music, every photograph, every medical record from every hospital that had uploaded its data to a cloud system before the system lost its human operators, every engineering blueprint, every recipe database, every collection of children's artwork from every school that had digitized its records, every hour of home video footage that had ever been uploaded to any server, every personal archive of every ordinary person who had ever thought their memories were worth preserving. 6 hours of compression from 80,000 years of human civilization. I did not explain it. I did not narrate it. I sat there while it played, and I watched the high assessor watch it, and I did not look away. I watched him watch the cave paintings, the first tools, the architecture, the music, the mathematics, the literature, the art, the medicine, the food, the love letters, the children's drawings, the sports, the celebrations, the grief, the recovery from grief, the relentless, iterative, imperfect, magnificent process of beings who were always trying to be better than they had been. Yesterday, 6 hours, when it finished, I turned off the display and I looked at him. I said through the translator, "That was what was in the file when you closed it." He did not respond immediately. He sat for a long time. Then he said something that the translator rendered as, "We did not." "No, I know you didn't," I said. "That is also a problem, but we will address that separately." I stood up. I told him that his fleet would be released crew by crew as sensory function returned. I told him that the remainder would remain in their midst while this happened, and that any hostile action would result in a return of the blindfold. I told him that we had a secondary deployment already distributed across the inner system, which was a Calculated exaggeration, though not entirely false, and that attempting to respond with force would achieve nothing useful for either of us. Then I told him that he and the other 6-member civilizations of the Varith Dominion had 1 galactic year to present themselves at Earth for a formal hearing on the matter of the erasure. You may come as diplomats, I said. That is the preference. I left the alternative unstated. I did not need to state it. He had seen what 17 humans had just done to 312 vessels with enough planning and anger and ingenuity to fuel a very particular kind of reckoning. He understood. I walked back through the corridors of the flagship and returned to the remainder. I sat in the pilot seat. Owen sat beside me. Through the forward display, I could see the fleet slowly coming back to ordered function. Crew members returning to their stations, lights cycling back to operational patterns. 312 ships that had come to confirm an extinction. 1 orbital engineer who had climbed out of a hole in the ground and refused to complete the paperwork. I opened a communication channel to every member of our network still active on Earth below. It worked, I said. Come up for air. The delegates arrived over the following 11 months in 1s and 2s and small groups, each arrival announced by communication on the frequency that had become our primary contact channel with the galactic community we had until recently not known existed. 5 of the 7 Dominion species sent delegations. 2 did not. I noted their absence without surprise and without visible reaction during the preparation sessions, though privately I had already set the monitoring satellites that we had managed to position in their home systems during the period between the fleet encounter and now. Cora had coordinated the launches using the modified sounding rockets we had developed for the blindfold deployment, loaded this time with small relay packages that would take months to reach their destination but would arrive eventually and begin their quiet work. We did not announce this. We did not need to. The 2 civilizations that stayed away were making a calculation. They were deciding whether our reach extended to them or whether their distance was sufficient protection. I was content to let them believe the question was still open. Open questions require attention and vigilance, and attention and vigilance cost resources and political energy that they would be spending on us rather than on anything else. That was fine. The tribunal convened on a Wednesday in the ruins of Geneva. I had chosen the location because Geneva had once been the place where humans went to make agreements with each other about how conflict should be handled, about what rules should govern the behavior of parties who had power over each other. It seemed correct. It was also in ruins, and the ruins were visible from every position in the open space where we had arranged the meeting, and the ruins said things I did not need to say myself. We had set up the meeting area in the open air. No roof, no walls, a flat space with a low table at its center and chairs arranged around it, simple chairs that our people had made from materials we had found and shaped ourselves. The delegates from the 5 attending civilizations had their own seating arrangements that they had brought with them, adapted to their particular physical requirements. 2,000 humans stood in a circle around the perimeter, not as guards, not as a display of force, exactly as witnesses. Every person in our network who was physically able to be there was there. People who had traveled from what used to be Ghana and Norway and Australia and Canada and Chile, traveling across a planet that was slowly, in some places, beginning to quietly return to function. Under our careful maintenance, crossing distances that would have taken them hours before and now took days, arriving in groups over the preceding weeks and camping in the city's parks and buildings. 2,000 people who had been underground or underwater or under ice. When the world ended, 2,000 people who had spent 14 months becoming invisible, and then spent 11 more becoming something entirely different. 2,000 people who had lost everyone they had ever known. They stood at the edge of the space and they were quiet. I stood at the table. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty matters more in the moments that define something than the polished version of events that people tend to construct. Afterward, I was tired. I was so tired that the tiredness had become a kind of background condition, something I moved through rather than something I felt. I had not slept properly in 3 weeks. I had been managing logistics, communications, translation dispute, security, protocols, the ongoing maintenance of systems that kept our people fed and warm, and the political reality of presenting a coherent face to 5 alien civilizations who were trying to assess, with understandable uncertainty, what exactly they were dealing with. I was 36 years old. I had been an orbital engineer who argued with geological survey equipment in a tunnel in Scotland. I was not supposed to be doing this, but there was no one else. I sat down at the table and I looked at the delegates from 5 civilizations who had, through vote or through silence, participated in the decision to remove humanity from existence. And I spoke in plain translated terms, without preamble or ceremony. You gathered and you decided that we should not exist. You made that decision without speaking to us, without visiting us, without giving us any opportunity to be understood or to respond. You made it based on assessment data compiled from observation alone, and you reached a conclusion and you acted on it. I paused. We are going to address that. But first I want to be precise about what this gathering is. This is not a trial in the sense that any of your civilizations would recognize. We are not positioned to enforce a verdict in the conventional sense, though I would invite you to consider carefully what we have demonstrated about our capacity for enforcement over the past year. This is something more specific. I looked at the delegate from the civilization that had drafted the original resolution the Species 12 had described to me as the architects of the Dominion's classification system, the ones who had developed the Class 0 designation and the resolution protocol. In the first place, this is an accounting, I said. What followed took 3 days. The delegates did not apologize, not in those early sessions. Apology requires something close to genuine understanding, and genuine understanding requires time. What they offered in the early sessions was explanation, which is a different thing, and which I was not certain I wanted, but which I listened to anyway, because understanding the reasoning of people who have done something wrong is part of addressing the wrong rather than simply reacting to it. Their reasoning, once translated and stripped of its administrative language, was this: the Dominion had encountered species before that demonstrated the combination of adaptive intelligence, territorial instinct and rapid technological development that humanity showed. In most cases, those species had, if left unchecked, eventually expanded in ways that destabilized established systems. The classification existed because the historical pattern was consistent. The resolution protocol existed because intervention before the expansion was judged less costly than intervention. During it, they had treated us as a category rather than as ourselves. I understood this reasoning completely. I understood it the way you understand how a mistake was made when someone walks you through it step by step, and you can see exactly where each decision seemed logical and exactly where the logic went wrong. I let them explain. I asked questions. I made our group's historian speak, the people we had designated to present specific accounts of human achievement across medicine, science, art, and social organization, not to perform grief, not to manipulate, to present evidence to demonstrate factually and specifically what the committee's assessment had failed to include. On the second day, the delegate from one of the smaller member civilizations asked me a question directly that I had been waiting for someone to ask. She asked what we wanted. I had the answer prepared. We had written it together, every significant member of our network contributing, arguing over language and priority and scope for months. It was not a short list, but it was a precise one, full and permanent galactic acknowledgement of the erasure as a crime against a sapient species, a formal record entered into every Dominion archive of what had been done and what the outcome had been, material reparations in the form of technological knowledge transfer sufficient to allow us to rebuild our civilization's industrial and medical base within a generation rather than over centuries. Political standing in the Dominion structure, a seat at every council and every committee and every classification board, permanent and non-revocable, and with full voting rights, and reclassification, a new designation for humanity in every Dominion record, the Class 0 notation removed and replaced with what, she asked. This was the question I had liked most. When we were preparing for this, it was the question that had taken the longest to answer because there were many proposals and many debates, and the one we had eventually settled on had won not because it was the most impressive sounding, but because it was the most accurate. I told her the designation we had chosen. I said it in translated Verith so there was no ambiguity in the room. The translation came out in something close to non-containable adaptive intelligence. Standing unresolved, she looked at me for a moment, then she did something I had not expected. She made a sound that the translation system could not render linguistically, but which Nell, listening through the communication link, described afterward as unmistakably resembling a laugh, not mockery, something closer to recognition. The agreement took 2 more days to formalize. There were disputes over specifics, over timelines, over the structure of the technology transfer, over the precise language of the classification record. I negotiated each point with the patience of someone who had learned to be patient by spending 14 months keeping 2,000 people alive on a planet full of empty cities. I did not give ground on the things that mattered. I was flexible on the things that were details. I knew the difference because I had been preparing to know the difference for a very long time. The agreement was signed on a Friday afternoon. I walked away from the table when it was done and found a piece of open ground near the edge of the gathering area, away from the noise of the crowd and the delegates and the communication teams. The sky above Geneva was overcast, gray-white clouds moving slowly from west to east. I stood there for a while. 2,000 people, a half-destroyed world. The work ahead of us was almost incomprehensible in scale. Rebuilding infrastructure, medical programs, education for children who had grown up in a world that had ended when they were young, navigating a galactic political structure that we had just forced our way into and which would not always be comfortable with our presence. Managing the two civilizations that still had not responded. The list of things to do was so long I had stopped being able to see the end of it, but beneath all of it there was something else, something that had not been there. On the day I climbed out of the survey shaft and looked at an empty sky, something that had not been there when I read the filing document by yellow emergency light in a university lab. We were in the record, not as a closed case, not as a checkbox, not as a problem that had been resolved and filed and forgotten. We were recognized in the official records of a civilization that had tried to remove us as something they had been wrong about, something they had failed to contain, something that remained unresolved in the best possible sense, which is the sense in which a thing is unresolved because it is still alive, still growing, still generating new questions that no one has thought to ask yet. I thought about the bureaucratic sign-off I had found in that university lab, the digital equivalent of a case number and a status update and a timestamp, filed, closed, complete. I did not have the document with me, but I had memorized it the way you memorize things that change the direction of your life. In my mind, I went to the bottom of the page. I found the status field. I crossed it out, standing in what had been Geneva, under a gray sky on a planet that still smelled faintly of rain and ash, and the long quiet of a year and a half without us, with 2,000 people at my back and an open file in a galactic council's permanent archive. I crossed it out, not complete, not even close.